Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our Native ancestors' stories and history alive, while also sharing with you our Native culture, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And I hope you'll do me a favor. Feel free to like and share these episodes. I so appreciate it. Yakuki.
I am more than a maker.
I'm more than an outdoorsman.
More than a protector.
Than a graduate.
Than a princess.
An athlete.
A pastor.
I'm more than a warrior.
Chata ilifinachili.
Chata ilifi nachili.
I am Choctaw proud.
I am Choctaw proud.
I am Choctaw proud.
We are the Choctaw Nation, and together we're more.
You're listening to part 2 of this series.
So, what is Grandma Johnny like?
She is like I hate to say the TV grandmother that everybody wished for, but I'll say that's what she was. I mean, she really was. When I stayed out there as a kid, more than a few times, I stayed out there when I was 3 or 4 years old for extended times. Having 4 kids and 2 parents that worked, my parents were always eager to send 1 or 2 of us to Arkansas if they could, or send us to the farm.
Right.
And so I spent a lot of time there. But I would say with her, it was like, what do you want for breakfast? What would you like for lunch? Dinner was served at the same time and every night, and she would stand there after cooking for everybody, would hand wash the dishes because she didn't like dishwashers. She was just a hardworking, sweet, tough lady.
So now her dad, so your great-grandfather, was John Simmons, a Choctaw. Do you know much about him?
So, well, I know some about him, and I was actually around him as a toddler, I guess. Yes. So, and it's interesting, the stories I always heard from my grandparents, well, especially about him. And I remember him and my great grandmother. We called her Mama, but her name was Lizzie. So he had apparently Alzheimer's, or he had dementia. And but they lived at my grandparents' house for their last few years, as typical. Those generations you just live in your folks' house, or you'd be taken care of. So and one of those summers that I stayed out there when I'm 3 or 4, they always talked about how my great grandfather would get up and he'd forget where he was going, but I would know where he was going. I would get up and grab his hand and walk him to the bathroom and take him in there. And then I'd go out and wait for him. He'd come out of the bathroom. I'd get his hand and walk him either to the kitchen or wherever. And they always said, "Hey, how did he know that? How are they communicating like that?" Because I didn't talk. I wasn't old enough to talk, and he was confused. But somehow
that's so sweet.
So I had that kind of connection with my great grandfather John, and then and that was when I was younger. So then when I was in 6th grade, his wife was still alive. We called her Mama. She was probably 91 or 92, and my grandmother Johnny cared for me and her.
Back to your dad's lineage, let's talk about his grandpa, or your great grandpa Jack Weaver Sr. And he served our country as well, correct?
Yes. So my great grandfather Jack, he started out in the Merchant Marines, and then he ended up in the US Navy, and he served in the Philippines, and this is prior to World War I, but he was in the Philippines and all around Europe, China, and then of course he ended up in World War I as well. But he worked in the bottom of he worked in the steam room down in the bottoms of the ships, in the boiler rooms, and he was a tough old man. He was
You'd
a really
have
tough
to
guy.
be. I mean, obviously it's got to be hot down there, right?
Super hot. And apparently, as I was asking my father, because my father knew him very well, and and said, what was he like? And he said, well, first he was like, and again, they grew up in the Bible Belt of Oklahoma, very, very, very conservative. Well, my great grandfather had tattoos, daggers, maybe naked ladies on his arms, and
Yeah.
was had been through the South Pacific pre World War One, and he used to
Oh.
say, and tops people the sailors that worked topside were for sissies, and
Ah.
the hard
Hmm.
guys were all down in the bottom. And it wasn't just because the coal and it was hot and everything, but it's also because if you took a torpedo, you weren't coming out.
You weren't coming out. That's right. I didn't even think about that.
That's where it's like the scary stuff is like when you're actually being fired upon and you're down below.
Yeah. Dang. Did your dad say anything else about his story?
Just that's just that he was a I mean, like any good Navy man would have been. He was a boxer, and he had
Of
very fast
course.
hands and could box, and would have been a contender, but he cut really easily, and but was even a boxer up into his after he got out of the military. They used to joke that nobody could sneak up on. He used to work in boiler rooms for high schools, the post office, all around Oklahoma
Yeah. He
during
had
the
the perfect
Depression.
resume for that.
And but they'd say they never would sneak up on him because he had very fast hands.
You don't want to sneak up on that guy.
No.
Well, you come not only from a long line of veterans, but of just really strong people. Now, that great grandpa Jack Sr., I'd like to talk about his brothers, Carlton, Otis, and John, also known as Dixie. So let's start with Otis Burton Weaver, born in 1876 in Mount Vernon, Texas. And the family at some point moved to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. And eventually, Otis ran for state senator, 23rd district. There was an article written about his run. So we'll get a little info about him from that article. In a nutshell, the Spanish American War broke out and he joined Roosevelt's Rough Riders, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's so cool. So Otis was a busy guy. He moved to Ada and got into the insurance business. And then he joined his brother Carlton in the newspaper business, eventually taking over as Carlton got busy in other areas. So, what else does that article that I mentioned, what does that talk about?
He became very involved in the community, raising awareness and funds for bridges, farmers, railroads, and more. Article says that early in 1905 at the Indian Territory and Oklahoma Statehood Convention, he was chosen as a member of the Joint Statehood Executive Committee. Later, when prospects for statehood were gloomy, the committee met in Tulsa. It was a crucial time for the cause of statehood, and the deliberations of that body were long and earnest. A campaign committee to agitate joint statehood was organized, and entirely without solicitation on his part, Mr. Weaver was chosen secretary thereof.
Okay, so this was a pivotal moment when, as you know, when Indian Territory would move into statehood. And as you listeners may know, when the removal happened, what many of us know as the Trail of Tears, Native Americans were forced from their homelands to an area promised to them called Indian Territory. And what some may not know is that the five civilized tribes, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Seminole, and Creek, had proposed in 1905 to regain the control of the lands of Indian Territory to create the state of Sequoia. And they proposed the Sequoia Convention Constitution, but it failed to go through Congress. So tell us what the article stated on that note. It's fascinating.
The coming on the combat with the Sequoia separate statehood movement, headed as was by some of the strongest men in the territory. The duties of that secretaryship became most responsible and arduous. During long and stressful months, Weaver sent out thousands of letters and hundreds of thousands of statehood campaign circulars. And every way possible, he aided in the anti-Sequoia campaign. Instead of the 125,000 votes voicefully predicted for the Sequoia Constitution, that document sank into oblivion with the support of 22,500.
That's insane. That's how far off they were. They thought that this would win.
Yeah.
Interesting. I always
Yeah.
wonder what would have happened. It's one of those moments in history where you go, what would have happened if that had been the case? Maybe nothing, maybe eventually the non-native population would still have taken over, and it would be what it is today. So Tecumseh was one of those in history that you go, what would have happened if he had been successful in getting all these different Native Americans of different tribes to come together and fight the white man? And it could have been a pivotal moment, but tribes who had said, yeah, we'll join you, dropped out left and right, or refused from the get-go to not help him. There's those moments like that in history that I think, wow, that was a pivotal, could have been changing moment in history. Okay, moving on. After the statehood bill was passed, the article says Otis B. Weaver was elected Major General commanding the United Sons of Confederate Veterans of the Indian Territory. And again, he ran as a Democrat for the state Senate, but I couldn't find anything stating he had won. Do you know if he won or lost?
I don't think he won, but what I find interesting, not to jump around, but just that he was there in that convention, because he must have brought
Yeah.
his little brother on, because I always wondered, how
Oh,
did
yeah.
Carlton Weaver get on, but
True.
that's kind of interesting there, because it seems like he never made it to office, but
Yeah.
that's
But those brothers were close. I mean,
yeah,
you read the articles and you realize that they all were helping each other.
all of
And
them were helping, and that's
yeah,
that's why I guess my grandfather moved around so much, because his older brothers had more influence, and he would take the jobs that he could get. It was in the
yeah.
depression, so there was no jobs, and that's what he did. So
So Otis really was known as a newspaper man, owning the Ada Evening News and then the Shawnee News. And I believe he merged two papers together as well at some point. Anyway, something I noticed was he and his little brother, both being newspaper men and politicians, they tended to cover the news of themselves quite a bit in the papers. I mean, what else are you going to do, right? You own the paper, may as well say whatever you want. And they really did help each other out a lot in their careers, or just like they'd say something, Otis is selling some livestock, or, they were constantly advertising for each other all the time. And I love it because it just felt like they were very much in control of the news that was getting out. They also were very close as family and helped each other. So Otis passed away in 1920, and the newspapers read, Shawnee editor dies suddenly of apoplexy. Apoplexy. I don't know how to say it, but what is apoplexy, you ask? All the people that you have recruited into healthcare are probably going, oh, she doesn't know how to say that word. Anyway, Wikipedia states apoplexy refers to the rupture of an internal organ and the associated symptoms. Informally or metaphorically, the term apoplexy is associated with being furious, especially as apoplectic. I should have looked up how to pronounce this word before this, but I totally forgot. So historically, it was used to describe what is now known as a hemorrhagic stroke involving a ruptured blood vessel in the brain. So interesting facts for all of us, and any listeners who want to correct me on my pronunciation, feel free. Another article from the Latimer County News Democrat touted how he was an important factor in upbuilding the state and how he was one of the Rough Riders. So, speaking of, let's talk about Roosevelt's Rough Riders, since Otis was one of them. Side note, I also looked for his brother Carlton among the list of Rough Riders, but couldn't find anything. Do you know if Carlton, was also a Rough Rider?
I don't believe Carlton was a Rough Rider. I know he
Okay.
went to World War I as like a 37-year-old man, but I don't believe he was a Rough Rider.
Okay, that's probably correct then, because I couldn't find anything and I looked for quite a while. So, what can you tell us about Roosevelt's Rough Riders?
Well, that's a good one too, and I'll tell you. Well, first of all, I also have a connection, in addition to my family, just for the fact that that was the Rough Riders stood up as basically a National Guard unit, and
Ah,
it started in Arizona, in northern Arizona, and it traveled across the states, Texas, Oklahoma, picking up troops as they went along. So when I was here in the National Guard in Arizona, I was in the artillery, the 153rd Field Artillery Brigade, and somewhere around 2005 or six, they cased their colors and turned back into the 158th Infantry. the 158th Infantry, and that is
Wow.
the Rough Riders. And that's who Michael Miller, Private Miller, ended up going to Afghanistan with, was the 158th Infantry. I digress. I mean, it's
Do you feel like there are so many
there's
strange,
so
interesting
much. It is.
connections
It's
here?
very. I mean, when I saw that, I was like, wow, the 158th Infantry. That's my guys.
That's
But
crazy.
that is, and sure enough, I mean, they came from Arizona, and they really are they were a bunch of cowboys and Indians, basically, and
Bear with
that's
me because I feel like this is one of those moments where you go, when you look into your own history and you realize you're patterning off of people that came before you, some of them you were even, related to. It's kind of an interesting scenario, isn't it? It's almost like, was this path laid out? And you may not have ever known it if you hadn't researched your family history originally.
correct, right? I mean, and that's where it's like every time I find, oh my gosh, that's so even the Rough Rider. I'd only heard stories from my grandfather about Dixie Weaver. Dixie Weaver was a Rough Rider. Uncle Dick. Uncle Dick was a tough guy. He was in the San Francisco fires. He was here. He was there.
Yeah.
And okay, so one day I'm in a bookstore and there was a book written by Theodore Roosevelt about the Rough Riders, and so I just flipped through the back
Amazing.
because it actually had the troop roster roles. And I mean, like,
Wow.
identified. So I sure enough, Otis B. Weaver, I knew that name. I said, oh my God, I'm looking for Dick Weaver. I didn't see it, but Otis B. Weaver was enough for me because I had already known that name from, my childhood. So I said, wow,
Right.
that's, there's really some
Oh,
truth in those stories that I was hearing as a kid. Holy cow. My friends will
that's
never believe
amazing.
this. My army
Right.
buddies will be, yeah, right. But no,
I have to
it's
actually go
true.
buy the book now.
We'll be back after this quick break. Are you in the medical field looking for your next opportunity? Listeners, I'm proud to introduce you to Native American veteran-owned staffing company, Worldwide Medical Staffing. Owner and CEO Jackson Weaver is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and is a service-connected disabled veteran where he and his team staff for commercial healthcare and government entities such as the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and DHS, and specialize in staffing Indian Health and VA hospitals nationwide. Isn't it nice to know that our veterans are being cared for by staff who have been handpicked by a veteran who's been in the staffing business for 17 years? Healthcare job seekers, check out these open jobs on www.medical.com. If you're seeking temporary, long-term, or permanent placement of physicians, advanced practice, registered nurses, and more, check out www.medical.com. And Diakoki to our medical professionals and to those who have served our country.
So, according to the Library of Congress, the most famous of all the units fighting in Cuba, the Rough Riders, was the name given to the first U.S. volunteer cavalry under the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in May 1898 to join the volunteer cavalry. The original plan for this unit called for filling it with men from Indian Territory, New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma. However, once Roosevelt joined the group, it quickly became the place for a mix of troops ranging from Ivy League athletes to Glee Club singers, Texas Rangers, and Indians. That's crazy to me. So it's interesting that the troops mentioned included Ivy League athletes and Glee Club singers and so on. It's like they wanted some glam to go along with the glory. Good marketing. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it goes back to kind of even like what we were just discussing. The National Guard right now, the infantry is apprised of guys that barely graduated high school, guys that have been on the fringe, could have been in trouble or could be out serving their country. And then it's also full of guys that are probably the smartest people I've met, most educated, but yet they didn't want to do anything other than pick up a rifle and do outdoor stuff. So you kind
Okay.
of get you get a mix of professionals, you get managers, you get I was selling real estate in my day job, but I was shooting artillery on my weekend job, and
Yeah.
that's kind of the kind of guys you get. So
Yeah.
I could see that happening for sure. Everybody you can only sit in your office for so long before you want to go out and blow something up, I'm sure.
Amen, especially when you've had a bad day. But
Yes.
that does put a different spin on it. And my perspective originally was like, were they recruiting specifically certain people so that they could be heralded in the newspapers, or what was that? So that just sounds like it's like any other time when it's any type
I
of
would
person.
say, and it's also those
Okay.
guys to me seem like they could afford to do that because that's one thing
Yeah,
people don't really understand about the Guard and is like you can make a lot more money in the civilian world than you can in the military. And
sure.
it's almost it's hard to give up the comforts and the money to go and serve your country. But some of those everybody wants to, I believe. I mean, to a degree, they all have a certain uh, passion for it. So
Yeah.
a lot of these people, if you can afford it, then definitely they can take the time off from their work or go on a 1 year campaign. Because back then it was we don't know how long this is going to go, and but
Yeah.
they also weren't signed up like we sign up. When it's over, you're out, and they would just muster you out of the service. Where
True.
today you still got a few more years on your enlistment or
Yep.
whatever you're obligated. So
Makes sense. Well, there were over 1,200 Rough Riders, including Teddy Roosevelt himself. Otis B. Weaver is listed as being in the first U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Rough Riders during the Spanish American War, May of 1898 to September of 1898. And he was promoted to sergeant in May of 1898. So Otis passed away in 1920 at the age of 43, and he's buried in Ada, Oklahoma. All right, so let's talk about Otis's brother Carlton. Sounds like he was also a pretty successful man. Tell us about him.
yes. Okay. So that's Uncle Carlton is the one that I heard about most often from my grandfather, Chief, and it
Okay.
was most likely for the reason that he went and lived with him for a year or two growing up
Oh,
himself in Oklahoma. Apparently, Chief's parents were so poor that he had to go live with his uncle, who had the newspaper and was more successful and could
oh, right.
clothe and feed him. And so he always had positive and good memories of his uncle, and he was very proud of the fact that he donated much of the land that's now Robbers Caves there in Wilburton. And we've been to Robbers Cave several times growing up, and took my kids there ourselves. And
Yes, I'm so
I'd
glad.
say he seemed, the more you read about him, the more he was into, whether he was had the newspaper, he was on the banking commission, he landowner, et cetera, et cetera. So he was a very busy guy. He was the youngest person at the Constitution Convention in 1905 for the statehood.
Oh,
He actually was a signer on the Oklahoma State Constitution of 1905. So he's on there. You'll see
how
Carlton Weaver's
interesting.
name. Yeah, he was a delegate, and so his name's on the Constitution. And then, of course, and that was in 1905. And then later on in his career, he became Speaker of the House in the 30s in Oklahoma. So he had a long history of business and politics, and then he had his cattle ranch as well. He had a 500-acre cattle ranch in between Wilburton and McAllister, and that's
Have you seen where that cattle ranch is?
no,
Have
I
you
have
gone there
not.
on it?
I know it was called like the Black and Gold Ranch, or that's what he had named it,
Oh,
but I don't
cool.
know exactly. Um, I haven't found it. No.
I just wonder if we have any listeners who, you know, may know where that is and own the land now. It'd be kind of interesting. So Carlton was born in 1881, and according to the Chronicles of Oklahoma, he helped establish the first permanent Boy Scout camp in 1926 in what later became Robbers Cave Park. So I know my Okies are going Robbers Cave Park. We know where that is. He is buried there on site among the pines he loved and near the lake that bears his name. When he passed away in 1947 at the age of 66, it was the 50th anniversary of the newspaper he had edited for 30 years. We've talked about the brothers Jackson Sr., Otis, and Carlton. Now we have to talk about another brother, John, otherwise known as Dixie, who you talked about earlier, who probably was, in my opinion, the most colorful of the characters. So Dixie was also most likely a Rough Rider, like his brother, and he was stationed while in the service in San Francisco during the earthquakes. The Ada Evening News, which was owned by his brother in May of 1906, wrote about his experience in the paper. Jackson, why don't you read from the paper about that incident?
Sure. So the editor of the news, in receipt of this from his youngest brother, Dixie Weaver, who was in the US Army stationed in San Francisco. He describes right graphically sights and sensations of the earthquake and fire disaster. It was about 5:18 in the morning when the earthquake came. Our company were all asleep in their cots. The building in which we were quartered is a brick called Fort Point, and it was built about 50 years ago in an old Spanish fort. 4 stories high, it covers 2 acres of ground on the very point of the peninsula on which the city is situated. When the shock began, of course, we all awoke. I realized what it was as soon as it came. My bunk was on rollers and it had started across the squad room. As I started to get up, the ceiling cracked. Down came a deluge of dirt and brick, which hurled me back on the bunk and buried me to the shoulders. When I found I could not get out, I just pulled the blanket over my head and prayed. Boys could be heard all about screaming and groaning. It was miraculous that the whole company was not killed. We were all out of the old fort. We could hear men, women, and children screaming, praying, and shouting, "The end has come." And then came alarm of fire. We rushed to town under arms. Our progress was difficult and perilous, for in places the earth was cracked open wide enough for man to fall in. We fought fire all that day and the next, and yet the next. People were shot down while removing their own stuff from their houses. The soldiers had orders to do it. It was awful to see terrorized and grief-stricken mothers running to and fro in search of their children. I can right now see the lines of people hundreds yards long waiting for bread. I saw one little girl, cold and hungry, buy a loaf of bread and start away when a Chinese man knocked her to the ground with a pistol, grabbed the loaf and ran. He ran but a short distance, for soldiers spying him shot him down. From that time on, Chinamen were killed like rats. The state militia were put on guard, but they got to killing many people so indiscriminately had to be taken away. They were a terrible nuisance. Now, just now, there was another shock. Perhaps you can see the difference in my writing. I'm too nervous to write. We have shocks all still every day and night. Guess I can't write now, so goodbye.
Wow. And it's interesting to hear the story and how scary it all was, but also just horrid to read about how Chinese people were being killed as well. I mean, horrible. And then chaos seems to have broken out. Do you remember anything else from your family talking about his being, present during this?
So this is the first time I ever read that. First of all, I had only heard, because again, the stories I heard is almost like this is too good, too legendary. How could somebody be in the San Francisco earthquake? How could somebody be in the Houston? Right. And so I always just thought those were legends, to be honest with you. And so to read this, especially in the first hand that he's saying he was buried by rubble, but even more interesting to me is also just him describing the fort that they were in. I mean, just being an old soldier thinking this is 1905, right? So he's staying in a fort that was built 50 years prior, right? So he's in a Spanish fort from 1840s or 50s built out of mud.
I didn't think about that. Okay. Yeah.
4 stories high.
Dang.
I mean,
They built it well, apparently.
A Spanish fort was built 50 years prior, so that's that to me was like, wow. But then to get on, with the shooting and the looting and the shooting of the Chinamen, I mean, the Chinese had a rough time in San Francisco up into the 60s and 70s. They had like anti-Chinese discrimination there for years.
For sure. And again, it went further back than I even knew. What I failed to do when I found that article was I should have also looked for just articles from San Francisco at the time to also see if they gave that color about what was going on with the Chinamen. So very crazy. So yes, this did happen to him, and it's not just a legend. Now, Dixie was also in Galveston during the floods of the early 1900s. According to the Library of Congress, the Night of Horrors, September 8th, 1900, begins as a 15-foot storm surge rolls across Galveston, Texas, killing over 8,000. Dawn breaks over a grisly scene of bodies in the streets. The Galveston flood is remembered even to this day as the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. I did not know that. So, do you know anything more about this time there during the floods and his story there?
I just have the family stories that he was there in either the aftermath or during the actual flood itself, and he survived it. I know that's the stories I've heard. So I haven't really gone into more than that. Just again, because
Yeah.
hearing you go, oh, okay, he was here, he was there, okay.
Right,
Um,
right.
I was more interested in, he went on to go into World War I, so that was where
Yeah,
earthquakes and fires as a kid, not as exciting.
whatever. So
Right.
you'd think a person who survived a major earthquake and massive floods would be lucky to survive anything. However, he wasn't that fortunate after all. Tell us about the fate of your great uncle Dixie.
So Uncle Dixie was a well, and this I read in the articles I found in some newspaper articles. Well, first he was one of the most popular first sergeants at his base, and I believe the base was located in New Jersey at the time. But
Okay.
back in his day, payday would come in cash. Okay, so if you're in the military, you got paid in cash and your payday was cash. So everybody was flush. So what they would do is have card games, big card games with
Yeah.
lots of money out. And apparently his card game was robbed at 4 in the morning by another soldier, by like a private. And um,
Wow.
Dixie Weaver did not feel like giving up his money that night and made a move, tried to fight the guy, and got shot and killed. And apparently they found it. It was a private. They chased the kid down through the base and 4 in the morning and caught him. And I know
Wow.
he was prosecuted. There was an article, but he was like a private in the army and robbed the card game and killed somebody. And that happened to be Dixie Weaver.
Wow. Of all things, he survived all these other things, and that's how he passed away. And did you say it was from a fellow you said he was a private as well? So, I
Yeah.
mean,
So
killed
he
by
was
his own
also
people?
killed by another soldier. And I don't think the soldier had anything to do with his units or anything. He just probably knew where the card game was being held or knew that there was something going on there.
Yeah.
And I don't think they knew the kid or anything. By that time, he was a first sergeant, and he might have been like early 40s himself when he was killed. Which I found interesting too, because he said it happened at like 4 in the morning. And me being
Yeah.
45, I can't remember the last time I was up till 4 in the morning. I mean, I remember waking up at 4 in the morning, but not staying up till four, especially playing
Yeah.
cards. It's
The
like you
only
really
time I'm
have
up
to
at
be,
4 in the morning is when I'm doing ancestry research,
yeah,
so
not playing cards and drinking. It's
No. Wow, it just shows how old we are in
yeah,
our
right.
brains. With that, though, you mentioned to me that you have this pistol from him, right?
I do. So I do.
Oh,
So that's
so cool.
that's 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 I have a Colt 1911 from World War I, and I have it basically. Dixie reported it as a combat loss in World War I, and paid. There was a receipt for it. I think he paid like $11 to the government for losing it, when in turn he really gave it to my great grandfather Jack, his little
Really?
brother. So uh, my
Aw.
great grandfather had it and passed it on to Chief, who basically had that with him up until he gave it to me 10 years ago himself. So that gun has been through France with my first uncle. Then it went to Korea with my grandfather. My grandfather carried it with him, had it updated from the US Air Force Armory in the 60s with a new barrel and new interworkings. But long story short, I still have it, and it's a treasured family heirloom. That is a fact.
That's amazing. It has to be one of the most special things you have in your life.
One of them, it really is, and it still works like it was brand new, even though it's
Are you
over 100 years
serious?
old.
Amazing.
Yes,
I have a layperson question here. What kind of bullets does it take?
it takes 45s.
45s, because it's a Colt 45. Got
It's a
it.
Colt
Okay.
45, right? And they still make the same gun today. I mean, it doesn't change. So it's except his is much older.
You are so lucky to have that. And I'm so glad that the men in your life knew to have the foresight to pass it down instead of get rid of it.
Very lucky. Very lucky.
Don't you wish you had met your Uncle Dixie?
Yes.
Great uncle.
I'd probably be afraid to meet some of those guys, but
they were tough boogers, man.
Stay tuned for part 3 of this series.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.